Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. For James Morgan, a dedicated single father working 2 jobs to make ends meet, that test came on a bitter winter evening. After a long shift at the construction site, he noticed his new neighbor, an elegantly dressed woman, standing helplessly before her shattered window. Without hesitation, he set aside his own exhaustion, gathered his tools, and spent the next hour carefully patching the broken glass. He refused payment, saying simply, "We look after each other here." Little did he know that this small act of kindness would crack open a door to possibilities he never imagined. What connection could this chance encounter forge between a struggling handyman and a woman who holds the key to his dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient coffee maker sputtered to life at 5:15 a.m., its familiar gurgle echoing through the quiet kitchen of the Morgan household. James stood before it, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped mug that had survived a decade of early mornings. Through the window, street lamps cast long shadows across untended flower beds, another item on his endless to-do list. "Dad?" Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs, still heavy with sleep. At 12, she had inherited her mother's habit of rising early, though James sometimes wished she'd sleep in like other kids her age. But Emma Morgan had never been like other kids, not since Sarah passed. "Down here, sunshine," he called softly, already pulling out the whole wheat bread she preferred for her lunch sandwiches. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he moved through their modest kitchen, each sound a reminder of repairs he couldn't afford to make. Emma appeared in the doorway, her school uniform slightly wrinkled but clean. He'd stayed up late, ironing it after his maintenance shift at the mall. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, something she'd learned to do herself after watching YouTube tutorials. The sight squeezed his heart. She shouldn't have had to grow up so fast. "You remembered to sign my permission slip?" she asked, sliding onto a worn kitchen stool. "For the Science Museum." James nodded, reaching for his wallet. The field trip cost $30, money that should have gone toward the electric bill, but he'd learned to juggle expenses like a circus performer. "All signed. Found it in your backpack last night." Emma's face brightened, then clouded with concern as she watched him count out singles for her lunch money. "I can bring something from home, Dad. Jenny always shares her chips with me anyway." "Hey now," James said, forcing lightness into his voice. "What's our rule about other people's lunches?" "We don't depend on anyone's kindness," Emma recited. But her eyes held too much understanding for a 12-year-old. He placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "That's right. Besides, I got that extra maintenance job at the Phillips building last week. Things are looking up." The lie tasted bitter. He'd actually lost that job to a younger handyman with better tools, but Emma's smile was worth it. She didn't need to know about the past due notices piling up in his drawer, or how he'd been skipping dinner 3 nights a week to make her lunch money stretch. As Emma ate her breakfast, James packed her lunch with the same precision he used. On construction sites, sandwich cut diagonally, no crust, apple sliced to prevent browning, and a small packet of fruit snacks he'd bought in bulk when they were on sale. Each item wrapped carefully, arranged just so. Sarah used to tease him about his attention to detail, calling him her perfectionist handyman. The memory of her laugh still echoed in this kitchen, 3 years after cancer had taken her. Sometimes James caught Emma standing in doorways, head tilted just like Sarah used to do, listening for echoes of her mother in the quiet house. "Bus is early today," Emma announced, shouldering her backpack. "Mrs. Peterson told me yesterday they changed the schedule." James grabbed his tool belt, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and his heavy work jacket. "I'll walk you to the stop." "Dad, I'm not a little kid anymore," Emma protested, but she waited for him by the door. Together they stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, their breath forming small clouds in the November air. The neighborhood was still sleeping, though lights were beginning to flicker on in other struggling households where parents rose early to make ends meet. At the bus stop, Emma hugged him quickly. She'd recently decided long hugs weren't mature, and climbed aboard. Through the window, she gave him their traditional wave, 3 fingers, then a peace sign, then a thumbs up, their secret code for "I love you." James waited until the bus turned the corner before checking his watch. He had 20 minutes to make it across town to the construction site. Just enough time if he jogged part of the way. The mortgage payment was due next week, and he couldn't afford to lose another job. As he started his trek, the tool belt heavy on his hip, James allowed himself one moment of pure exhaustion. Then he straightened his shoulders and picked up his pace. Emma needed new shoes for winter, and dreams couldn't pay bills. The Victorian house next door had stood empty for so long that its sudden signs of life caught the entire neighborhood's attention. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning, but it wasn't the typical rental company vehicle that usually appeared in their working-class neighborhood. This was a specialist art and antiques transport service, its pristine white exterior bearing a gold-leafed company name. James noticed it from his kitchen window while mixing instant coffee before his evening maintenance shift. More interesting than the truck was the woman directing the movers. Tall, silver-streaked hair swept into an elegant knot, wearing clothes that spoke of careful selection rather than careful budgeting. She moved with purpose, consulting what appeared to be hand-drawn plans rather than a moving company checklist. "Dad, she looks like one of those ladies from your home renovation shows," Emma observed, pressing her nose against the glass. She wasn't wrong. The woman had that same air of confident sophistication that James sometimes glimpsed on late-night TV during those rare moments when exhaustion kept him awake past his usual bedtime. "Don't stare, sunshine," he reminded her gently, though he found himself stealing glances as well. The Victorian had been a neighborhood landmark once, before time and neglect had dulled its grandeur. The realtor's sign had appeared and disappeared so many times over the years that most locals had stopped noticing it. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street was already making her way over, welcome basket in hand, a neighborhood tradition she maintained despite her own tight budget. James watched as she introduced herself to the newcomer, noting how the woman's reserved expression warmed into genuine pleasure at the gesture. "Catherine Wells," he heard the new neighbor say, her voice carrying clearly through the autumn air. "I've been searching for the right restoration project for months." Restoration. The word stirred something in James's professional mind. The Victorian would need more than restoration. It would need resurrection. The roof sagged noticeably on the north side, and he'd spotted evidence of serious water damage around the dormers last summer when he'd helped Mrs. Rodriguez clear her gutters. Later that evening, after Emma had settled in with her homework, James found himself studying the house from his porch. The moving truck was gone, but lights burned in several windows, casting warm rectangles onto the unkempt lawn. Through one of them, he could see Catherine Wells, bent over what appeared to be architectural drawings spread across a makeshift table of moving boxes. She worked with the focused intensity he recognized from his own late nights with repair manuals and DIY guides, trying to figure out how to fix things he couldn't afford to have professionally repaired. There was something almost familiar about her dedication, though everything else about her spoke of a world far removed from his own. A soft thud drew his attention to his own house's needs. Another shingle had probably worked loose near the chimney. He'd have to find time this weekend to check it out, maybe see if he could scrounge some materials from the construction site's discard pile. The foreman usually looked the other way when workers took home leftover supplies. The sound had caught Catherine's attention too. She glanced up from her work, meeting his gaze through the window. For a moment, they regarded each other across the short distance between their properties. Two people with very different lives, connected by nothing more than proximity and an appreciation for old houses in need of care. James nodded politely and turned to head inside. As he did, he noticed Emma's bedroom light was still on, well past her bedtime. He climbed the stairs, ready to remind her about their early morning. Routine but paused in her doorway. She sat at her small desk, carefully drawing what appeared to be her own version of architectural plans for their house. "Just ideas," she said quickly, covering the paper with her arm. "Like the lady next door has." James felt the familiar ache of a parent seeing their child dream beyond their means. "Those are some fancy drawings, sunshine, but it's past time for bed." As he tucked her in, something she claimed she was too old for but still secretly enjoyed, Emma whispered, "Maybe she'll fix up the whole neighborhood, Dad, like on TV." "Maybe," he answered softly, knowing better than to encourage impossible hopes. "Sweet dreams, architect." But as he turned out her light, he couldn't help glancing once more at the Victorian next door, where Catherine Wells still bent over her plans, plotting changes that would soon ripple through their quiet community, in ways none of them could predict. The day of the window incident began like any other, with James trudging home from his construction shift, grocery bags cutting into his calloused palms. The November wind had picked up, carrying the first hint of winter's bite, and his thoughts were focused on whether he'd remembered to leave the space heater running in Emma's room. The power bill would suffer, but he couldn't bear the thought of her shivering through another night. The sound of breaking glass shattered the evening quiet. It came from the Victorian, followed by a muffled exclamation that might have been frustration or dismay. James paused, grocery bags swaying, and watched as Catherine Wells emerged onto her front porch, phone in hand. Her usual composure noticeably rattled. "No, I understand completely," she was saying, her free hand running through her silver-streaked hair. "But surely there must be someone available tonight. Yes, I realize it's after hours, but—" She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it with the universal expression of someone who's been disconnected. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and through the broken window, James could see heavy drapes billowing in the wind. He knew exactly how quickly a house could lose heat through a breach like that. More importantly, he knew how dangerous a broken window could be, the jagged edges waiting like teeth in the growing darkness. Setting his groceries on his own porch, James disappeared into his garage. The worn tool belt he'd inherited from his father still hung in its designated spot, along with the emergency repair kit he'd assembled over years of maintenance work. He grabbed both, along with his work gloves and a drop cloth, before heading. "Next door, Mrs. Wells," he called out, keeping his distance to avoid startling her. "I'm James Morgan from next door. I noticed you might need some help with that window." Catherine turned, surprise and relief warring on her face. "Mr. Morgan, yes, it was the most absurd accident. The wind caught an old picture frame I was hanging, and—" She gestured helplessly at the window. "Every emergency repair service is booked solid. Something about a major storm system coming in." James nodded, already assessing the damage. It was a classic double-hung window, probably original to the house, with the kind of craftsmanship you rarely saw anymore. The break was clean through the lower pane, but the frame itself appeared intact. "I can help you secure it for tonight if you'd like. It won't be pretty, but it'll keep out the cold and any unwanted visitors until you can get a proper replacement." She hesitated, and he recognized the internal calculation, the same one he made whenever accepting help meant admitting vulnerability. "I wouldn't want to impose—" "No imposition," he assured her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I do this kind of thing all the time. Part of my job, actually." He held up his tool belt as evidence. "Besides, we look after each other here. It's how the neighborhood works." Something in his tone must have reassured her, because she nodded, stepping aside to let him approach the window. Up close, the damage looked worse. The break had spider-webbed across the entire pane, held together only by the window's ancient glazing. James worked methodically, first laying down the drop cloth to catch any falling glass, then carefully removing the loosest shards. He was aware of Catherine watching him, her arms wrapped against the cold, but his focus remained on the task. Years of experience guided his hands as he cleaned the frame, applied a temporary sealant, and secured a piece of heavy-duty plastic, with a precision that would hold until proper repairs could be made. "You've done this before," Catherine observed, and there was something in her voice, not just appreciation, but professional assessment. James secured the last corner of the plastic. "A few times," he admitted. "The trick is getting the seal tight enough to keep out drafts without stressing the frame. Old windows like these, they've got their own character. You have to work with them, not against them." "That's exactly right," she said softly. And when he glanced over, she was studying him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. Most people don't understand that about old houses. They try to force modern solutions onto historical problems. He packed away his tools, suddenly conscious of the paint stains on his work boots and the fraying edge of his jacket. "Well, this is just temporary. You'll want to get a professional out here for a proper repair." "I will," Catherine agreed, reaching for her purse, "and I insist on paying you for your time." James held up a hand. "No need. Like I said, it's what neighbors do." He gathered his supplies, eager to check on his own house and daughter. "Just be careful with the rest of these windows. They're probably all original, which means they're all equally fragile." "Mr. Morgan," Catherine called as he started down her porch steps. "Thank you. Not just for the repair, but for understanding about the windows, about the house." He paused, looking back at the Victorian with its missing shutters and peeling paint. "Houses like this, they deserve someone who understands them." Then, embarrassed by his own sentimentality, he added, "Good night, Mrs. Wells." As he retrieved his groceries and headed inside, James didn't notice Catherine watching him thoughtfully, nor did he see her pull out a small notebook and begin writing. His mind was already on dinner preparation and Emma's homework, on bills to be paid and repairs to be made. Just another evening in a life built around making ends meet. But sometimes the smallest actions can crack open the door to change, letting in possibilities as delicate and potentially transformative as a spider's web of broken glass. Catherine Wells sat in her makeshift office, surrounded by blueprints and restoration plans, but her attention kept drifting to the temporarily repaired window. The plastic covering had been applied with such precision that it was nearly invisible in the darkness. From her leather portfolio, she withdrew the business card she hadn't shared with James Morgan, Catherine Wells, Executive Director, Wells Community Restoration Foundation. The foundation's board would be expecting her usual detailed report tomorrow, but for once, the architectural survey wasn't foremost in her mind. Instead, she found herself writing about the unexpected lesson in craftsmanship she'd witnessed. 20 years of high-end restoration projects, and she'd never seen anyone handle century-old windows with such intuitive understanding. Her phone buzzed, a text from her assistant about tomorrow's board meeting. Found something interesting. In the Milton Street survey. The question made Catherine smile. If they only knew. She'd chosen this neighborhood carefully after months of demographic research and community assessments. The Victorian had been the perfect cover, a legitimate restoration project that would let her observe the community's dynamics firsthand. But she hadn't expected to find what she was looking for on her first day of residence. Rising from her desk, Catherine walked to the window where James had worked. His daughter's bedroom light was still on next door, and through it, she could see the girl bent over what appeared to be homework. The scene struck a chord in her that had nothing to do with professional interest. 25 years ago, she'd been that child, watching her own single father struggle to keep their world intact. The memory of his worn hands, stained with paint from endless repair jobs, had driven her career choices. Now her foundation renovated entire neighborhoods, but they never quite captured the spirit of genuine community she'd witnessed tonight. Catherine retrieved her laptop, opening the preliminary neighborhood assessment. James Morgan's name appeared. In the property records, mortgage 3 months behind, property in need of significant repairs, but no liens or judgments. A man doing his best to hold things together with determination and duct tape. What caught her attention was his employment history, 15 years of construction and maintenance work, a pattern of taking on extra jobs, perfect attendance records. The kind of reliability that couldn't be taught, and that inherent understanding of old buildings, the way he'd talked about windows having character. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her contractor, finally responding to her emergency call about the window. "Can have someone there tomorrow morning, Ms. Wells. Emergency rates apply." She declined the offer with a polite text. The temporary repair would hold, and she had more important plans to consider. Opening a fresh document, she began to type, "Proposal, Milton Street Pilot Program Project Lead Candidate. James Morgan qualifications. Demonstrated expertise in historical restoration techniques. Deep community connections, proven work ethic." Catherine paused, glancing again at the window. In her 2 decades of community development work, she'd learned that success depended not just on funding and expertise, but on finding the right people. Those rare individuals who understood both, the technical and human elements of restoration. The sound of a child's laughter drifted through the walls, followed by James's deeper voice. Something about homework and bedtime. Catherine smiled, remembering similar negotiations with her own father. He'd passed away before seeing her foundation's first successful project, but she liked to think he'd appreciate what she was about to do. She returned to her proposal, adding notes about establishing a training program, creating local employment opportunities, and setting up an educational fund for community youth. The board would question her unconventional approach, but she'd learned to trust her instincts. Tomorrow, she would return to being Catherine Wells, the foundation director with multiple degrees and a portfolio of successful urban renewal projects. But tonight, she was simply the new neighbor whose window had providentially broken at exactly the right moment. From her briefcase, she withdrew the foundation's newest initiative, a community restoration grant program she'd spent months designing. The criteria seemed to have been written with James Morgan in mind. Demonstrated skills, community involvement, potential for growth. Sometimes the perfect candidate appeared in the most unexpected ways. Catherine added a final note to her proposal. "Recommend immediate implementation." Then she stood at the window again, watching as the lights in the Morgan house dimmed one by one. Tomorrow would change their lives, but tonight, let them rest in the quiet comfort of their usual routine. The best transformations, she'd learned, often began in such simple moments. Morning brought a fresh dusting of snow and the distant rumble of Emma's school bus. James stood at the kitchen sink, washing out his coffee mug before heading to work, when an unfamiliar car pulled into Catherine Wells's driveway. Not the practical sedan she'd been driving, but a sleek, late-model luxury vehicle that seemed to gleam even in the weak winter sunlight. He watched, coffee mug forgotten in his hands, as Catherine emerged wearing a tailored business suit that spoke of boardrooms rather than renovation projects. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with a purposeful stride that made him instinctively straighten his posture, even though she couldn't see him through the window. The doorbell rang, just as he was reaching for his tool belt. "Mr. Morgan?" Catherine greeted him, her professional demeanor softened by a genuine smile. "I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time." "Just heading out, actually," he replied, acutely aware of his worn work clothes and the paint stains on his boots. "Everything all right with the window?" "Perfect, thanks to you, but that's actually why I'm here." She gestured to her car. "Do you have a few minutes? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." James hesitated, checking his watch. The construction site was a 20-minute walk away, and his shift started in 30. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wells, but I can't be late for work. Please call me Catherine." She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a business card, offering it with a slight smile. "And I've already called your supervisor at Bronson Construction. He's agreed to give you the morning off, with pay." James stared at the card in his hand, its elegant embossing catching the morning light. Catherine Wells, Executive Director, Wells Community Restoration Foundation. Below that, impressive credentials and contact information for what appeared to be a significant organization. "I don't understand," he said slowly, though part of him was beginning to piece it together, the moving truck, the architectural drawings, her careful observation of the neighborhood. "Let me buy you a coffee," Catherine suggested. "The foundation's driver can take us to that diner on Market Street. I hear they serve a decent breakfast." 20 minutes later, James sat across from Catherine in a corner booth at Randy's diner, a full plate of eggs and hash browns before him that she'd insisted on ordering despite his protests. The coffee was better than his instant variety at home, and he wrapped his hands around the warm mug while Catherine laid out a proposal that seemed too good to be true. "The foundation specializes in community restoration projects," she explained, spreading photographs across the table. "Not just buildings, but entire neighborhoods. We provide funding, training, and employment opportunities to help communities rebuild themselves from within." The photos showed before and after transformations of neighborhoods, much like his own. Worn houses renewed, community centers established, gardens where vacant lots had been. But it was the images of people that caught his attention. Local residents, working alongside professional contractors, learning trades, developing skills. "Your work on my window last night confirmed what I'd suspected from watching you," Catherine continued. "You have an innate understanding of historical architecture and a genuine commitment to this community. Those are rare qualities, Mr. Morgan." "James," he corrected automatically, still processing her words. "But I'm just a handyman, a construction worker." Catherine's eyes sharpened. "You're a skilled craftsman who's never had the opportunity to fully develop his potential. Last night you demonstrated more insight into historical restoration in 5 minutes than some certified contractors show in years." She pulled out another document. His property records, he realized with a jolt. "Your house needs significant repairs. The foundation is prepared to fund a complete renovation, with you overseeing the work. Additionally, we'd like to offer you a position as project manager for our Milton Street Restoration Initiative, starting with the Victorian next door." James set down his coffee cup carefully. "Why me?" "Because you understand that restoration isn't just about buildings, it's about preserving the heart of a community while helping it grow." Catherine's voice softened. "And because 25 years ago, I was your daughter's age, watching my own father work multiple jobs to keep our family afloat. He never got the chance I'm offering you now." The mention of Emma cut through James's hesitation. "The salary would be substantial enough for you to quit both your current jobs, full benefits, including health insurance and a college fund contribution program for Emma." She slid a contract across the table. "We also provide comprehensive training and certification programs." James stared at the paper, his throat tight. The numbers listed there could change everything. No more missed dinners, no more choosing between bills, no more watching Emma try to hide her disappointment when he couldn't afford school activities. "It seems too good to be true," he said finally. Catherine smiled. "Sometimes life offers us a window of opportunity. The trick is being brave enough to climb through it." She paused, then added gently, "Your daughter told me about her architectural drawings. She has her father's eye for potential." James looked up sharply. "When did you—" "This morning, while waiting for her school bus. She said you taught her that old houses are like people. They just need someone to believe in them." The words, his words to Emma, repeated so many times over the years, echoed back to him now, heavy with new meaning. James picked up the contract, reading more carefully this time. Not just an opportunity for himself, but a chance to show Emma that dreams sometimes did come true. "Where do I sign?" The weight of the new badge felt strange against James's chest as he stood before the Victorian house early Monday morning. The crisp navy uniform shirt with Wells Foundation embroidered above the pocket still had department store creases, and the steel-toed boots Catherine had insisted on purchasing gleamed spotlessly in the morning sun. He felt like an imposter in borrowed clothes, playing at being someone important, but the tool belt around his waist was his own. worn leather carrying the memories of countless repairs, the tools arranged exactly as they had been for 15 years. Catherine had nodded approvingly when he'd brought it to the orientation meeting yesterday. The best craftsmen, she'd said, never forget where they started. A truck pulled up carrying the first crew of the day. These weren't the usual construction workers James was accustomed to. Instead, a team of preservation specialists emerged, carrying tablets loaded with architectural drawings and restoration guidelines. They nodded respectfully as they approached. "Mr. Morgan," the lead specialist greeted him, extending a hand. "I'm David Chen. We've heard good things about your work with historical windows." James almost looked over his shoulder, expecting to find someone else they must be addressing. But there was only him, standing there with his inherited tool belt and a lifetime of making do. "Just James is fine," he managed. "Actually," Catherine's voice came from behind him, "according to the new organizational chart, it's Project Manager Morgan." She joined them, tablet in hand, looking every inch the foundation director in her tailored suit. But there was a warmth in her eyes that helped steady his nerves. "Shall we begin the initial assessment?" The next few hours transformed James's understanding of restoration work. He found himself drawn into detailed discussions about load-bearing, calculations, period-appropriate materials, and preservation techniques that put names to things he'd learned through years of trial and error. More surprisingly, the specialists actually listened when he spoke, taking notes as he explained his observations about the house's peculiarities. "See how the morning light hits this corner," he demonstrated, pointing to a shadowed alcove. "There's probably a secondary support beam hidden behind that later addition. These old houses, they tell you their secrets if you know how to look." David Chen nodded enthusiastically, adding to his notes. "This is exactly the kind of insight we need. Too often, we get so caught up in technical specifications that we miss the building's natural patterns." By lunchtime, James had forgotten to feel self-conscious about his new role. He was in his element, moving through the house's rooms with growing confidence, translating between the technical language of the specialists and the practical realities of restoration work. Catherine observed quietly, interjecting only occasionally with questions that seemed designed to draw out his knowledge rather than test it. "You're a natural teacher," she commented during a brief break. "The way you explained the window restoration process to the team, it was technical enough for the specialists but clear enough for the general contractors." James shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just repeating what I've learned over the years." "That's exactly what makes it valuable," Catherine insisted. "Theory and practice meeting in the middle. It's why we needed someone like you for this project." As the afternoon wound down, James found himself alone in what would become the Victorians' main office. The leather chair behind the desk, his desk now, incredibly, still had its price tag tucked discreetly underneath. On the wall hung his new credentials, certifications he'd earned through years of work but never had officially recognized, now validated through the Foundation's acceleration program. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "How was your first day as a boss?" Before he could reply, another message appeared. "Mrs. Rodriguez says she saw you wearing a uniform and giving orders to fancy architects." James smiled, thinking of how quickly news traveled in their tight-knit community. He typed back, Old Dad's learning new tricks. Wait till you see the plans we made today." Emma's response was immediate. "Told you we'd fix up the whole neighborhood, just like on TV." Looking out the office window at his own house next door, James felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, but also a kind of vindication. All those years of patching things together, of learning through necessity rather than formal training, hadn't been just about survival. They'd been preparing him for this moment. On his desk lay the preliminary budget for his house's renovation, approved that morning with a casual signature from Catherine that represented more money than he'd seen in years. But somehow, that paper meant less to him than the respectful attention of the restoration team, the way they'd valued his practical knowledge as much as their advanced degrees. For the first time in years, James Morgan stood tall in steel-toed boots that were his own, not borrowed at all. The morning they began work on the Morgan house dawned clear and cold, with frost etching delicate patterns on the windows that would soon be replaced. James stood in his kitchen one last time, surrounded by packed boxes and wrapped photographs, while Emma darted between rooms, making sure they hadn't forgotten anything important. "Dad!" she called from upstairs. "I found Mom's garden journal behind the bookshelf." The leather-bound notebook had been Sarah's pride and joy, filled with careful sketches of the flower beds she'd planned but never got to plant. James tucked it carefully into his personal box, alongside the family photos and Sarah's last Mother's Day card. The foundation had arranged temporary housing in a fully furnished apartment just 2 blocks away, close enough to oversee both renovation projects, Catherine had explained, but far enough to avoid construction dust and noise. Still, leaving felt strange, like stepping out of a well-worn pair of shoes into something new and untested. "Everything's labelled according to the preservation plan," David Chen confirmed, reviewing his tablet as the work crew arrived. "We'll document every stage of the renovation, especially the original features you identified." James nodded, running his hand along the living room doorframe where pencil marks tracked Emma's growth over the years. "This trim stays," he reminded them. "We talked about replacing it, but some things are more valuable than period-accurate." "Molding," Catherine finished, appearing beside him. She'd swapped her usual business attire for practical work clothes, her silver hair tied back with a bandana. "We're preserving memories as well as architecture." The work began methodically, with careful attention to both structural needs and emotional attachments. James found himself moving between supervisor and homeowner roles, sometimes directing the crew on technical details, other times sharing stories about particular features they uncovered. "This wallpaper," he explained to the documentation team, pointing to a faded pattern revealed behind old drywall, "was here when Sarah and I bought the place. We spent our first weekend trying to strip it off, laughing at how horrible it was. Never did get it all." Catherine joined him, studying the pattern. "We could preserve a small section," she suggested. "Frame it maybe alongside the before photos we're taking." Emma, who had been allowed to skip school for this important day, brightened at the idea. "Could we make a whole memory wall with pictures of the renovation and old photos and everything?" "That's actually a wonderful documentation idea," Catherine said, making a note on her tablet. "We could implement something similar in all our community projects, helping families preserve their history while we improve their homes." The morning progressed with discovery after discovery. Beneath worn carpeting, they found original hardwood floors that could be restored. Inside an old heating vent, Emma discovered a tiny time capsule she'd made in 2nd grade and forgotten about. Each revelation was carefully photographed and catalogued, becoming part of both the renovation record and the Morgan family history. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared mid-morning with a cooler full of sandwiches and her famous lemonade. Soon, other neighbors followed, bringing food and memories to share. The worksite gradually transformed into an impromptu community gathering, with long-time residents telling stories about the house's history to the restoration team. "Your father helped install that bay window," old Mr. Peterson reminded James, pointing to the front of the house. "Must have been, 30 years ago? Did it for half what the contractors were charging, and twice as well." James smiled, remembering how his father had taught him about proper window alignment using that very project. Now, decades later, he was teaching those same techniques to a new generation of craftsmen, but with the backing of modern technology and professional resources. The day's most poignant moment came when they began work on the kitchen. As the crew carefully dismantled the old cabinets, they uncovered a message written in Sarah's handwriting on the wall. "Morgan Family Kitchen Est 2010, where love grows along with the grocery bills." Emma's eyes welled up at the sight of her mother's words, and James felt his own throat tighten. Without a word, Catherine directed the renovation team to pause their work. She stepped forward with a preservation spray, carefully protecting the handwriting before documenting its exact location on the plans. "We'll design the new cabinets around it," she said quietly. "Some things deserve to be the heart of a home." By sunset, the Morgan house was a careful balance of past and future, tarps protecting precious memories while plans for improvement took shape around them. As James locked up for the night, he realized that every crack and worn spot he'd worried over for years now held the promise of renewal rather than the weight of limitation. "Ready for our temporary adventure?" he asked Emma, who was still clutching her mother's garden journal. She nodded, then asked hopefully, "Can we plant her flowers when we come back home?" "The ones from Mom's drawings?" Catherine, overhearing as she packed up her tablet, shared a meaningful look with James. "I think we could definitely include a memorial garden in the landscaping plans. In fact," she added with a warm smile, "I know an excellent landscape architect who specializes in historical garden restoration." The temporary apartment had a proper dining room, something their old house had never possessed. It was here, 3 weeks into the renovation, that Emma insisted on hosting what she called a fancy dinner for Catherine. James found himself in the unfamiliar position of supervising his daughter's ambitious culinary plans while trying to keep their guest of honor from discovering the inevitable chaos in the kitchen. The recipe said, "Fold in the cheese," Emma whispered frantically, staring at the massacre of their third attempt at homemade macaroni and cheese. "I didn't know that meant something specific." James surveyed the damage, remembering similar cooking. "Adventures with Sarah. Well, sunshine. Looks like we're learning together. Your mum always said cooking was just construction with food. You have to build from the foundation up." The doorbell rang just as they were debating whether to order takeout. Catherine stood there holding a covered dish, her usual professional demeanor softened by casual clothes and a knowing smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said, stepping inside, "but I had a feeling you might need reinforcements." The dish turned out to be her grandmother's legendary lasagna, and soon the apartment filled with the warm scent of herbs and tomatoes. Instead of hovering awkwardly in the dining room, they gathered in the kitchen, where Catherine guided Emma through the art of proper garlic bread, while James prepared a salad. "My father was hopeless in the kitchen too," Catherine shared, showing Emma how to brush melted butter without drowning the bread. "After Mom passed, we survived on sandwich variations for months until our elderly neighbor took pity on us. Mrs. Chen, no relation to David, she taught me that cooking was really about creating memories more than meals." Emma nodded sagely, wielding her butter brush with newfound confidence. "Like how Dad says buildings tell stories if you know how to listen." Exactly like that. Catherine's eyes met James's over their daughter's head, sharing a moment of understanding that made his heart skip. He quickly turned his attention back to the salad, aware of a warmth in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the kitchen's temperature. The meal itself was a triumph of collaboration. Catherine's lasagna, Emma's carefully crafted garlic bread, only slightly charred on one edge, and James's contribution to kitchen architecture, as he termed his elaborate salad construction. More importantly, it was filled with easy conversation and genuine laughter. "Did Dad tell you about Mr. Chen's face when they found the marble collection inside the Victorian's walls?" Emma asked, serving Catherine a second helping of lasagna with all the gravity of a master chef. "I heard there were quite a few treasures in those walls," Catherine replied, accepting the generously portioned plate. "But I'm more interested in hearing about your science fair project. Your father mentioned something about historical architecture?" Emma launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her project, comparing modern building materials with historical ones, inspired by both renovation sites. James watched in quiet amazement as Catherine asked detailed questions, offering suggestions. That perfectly balanced professional insight with 12-year-old comprehension. After dinner, Emma insisted on handling the cleanup alone. "It's what fancy restaurant hosts do, Dad," leaving James and Catherine to settle on the apartment's small balcony. The evening air carried the first hint of spring, and in the distance they could see the illuminated scaffolding around both houses, like ships docked in the growing darkness. "She's remarkable," Catherine said softly, watching through the window, as Emma orchestrated her cleanup operation with serious determination. "You've done an incredible job with her, James." "Some days I wonder," he admitted, voicing thoughts he usually kept buried. "If Sarah were here, she'd be proud," Catherine finished firmly. "Of both of you." She paused, then added, "You know, I've overseen dozens of community projects, but I've never been invited to a family dinner at any of them." Emma's right. It was quite fancy. James chuckled, relaxing into the comfortable silence that followed. It struck him that this moment, watching his daughter through the window, sharing quiet conversation with Catherine, felt more like home than any building ever had. "We're thinking of planting the first flowers from Sarah's journal this weekend," he found himself saying. "Just a small starter garden at the apartment until the real one's ready. Emma would love your input if you're free." Catherine's smile held the warmth of genuine pleasure. "I'd like that very much. I may not be a master chef, but I did learn a thing or two about gardens from my mother." Inside, Emma had begun humming as she worked, the same tune Sarah used to sing during family chores. But for the first time, the melody brought more comfort than pain, carried on the aroma of shared lasagna and new possibilities. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning, when the restoration team removed the Victorian southeast corner paneling. James was in his new office reviewing budget proposals when David Chen burst in, tablet in hand and face drawn with concern. "Mr. Morgan, you need to see this," David said, his usual calm professionalism cracking slightly. "The primary support beam, it's much worse than the initial survey indicated. In the exposed wall cavity, decades of unchecked water damage had turned what should have been solid oak into something resembling damp cardboard." James ran his hand along the beam, feeling the wood give slightly under even gentle pressure. His mind raced through calculations. Weight distribution, temporary support requirements, material costs that would blow their carefully planned budget to pieces. "Have you notified the foundation yet?" he asked, already knowing this would require Catherine's immediate attention. The beam didn't just support this corner, it was integral to the entire east wing structure. "I wanted your assessment first," David replied. "Given your experience with historical structures, the vote of confidence steadied James's nerves. 5 weeks ago, he would have seen this as a catastrophe. Now he recognized it as a challenge to be solved. "Call in the structural team," he directed, "and have someone bring me the original blueprints from the city archives. I think I remembered seeing something about a secondary support system in the original design." Within an hour, the Victorian's main room had transformed into an emergency command center. Engineers huddled over laptops, preservation specialists debated material options, and in the center of it all, James stood before a massive timeline. He'd sketched on a whiteboard. Catherine arrived just as he was finishing his preliminary action plan. She took in the scene with the composed attention he'd come to admire, asking precise questions that helped clarify rather than challenge his proposals. "The good news," James explained, pointing to his drawings, "is that the original architect built in a redundancy we can utilize. The bad news is that accessing it requires us to open up 3 more walls and temporarily relocate the electrical system we just upgraded." "Cost implications?" Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already knew and had accepted the answer. "We're looking at a $60,000 increase minimum," James admitted, "plus a 3-week delay on the overall timeline." He braced himself for disappointment, remembering too many construction site supervisors who'd chosen quick fixes over proper solutions. Instead, Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "Walk me through your repair strategy." James guided her through his plan, developed from years of working around similar problems with far fewer resources. "Here's the clever part of the original design," he explained, indicating a series of load-bearing points. The architect anticipated potential beam failure. See how these support columns are positioned. With modern materials and techniques, we can actually improve on the original design while maintaining its historical integrity. "Remarkable," Catherine murmured, studying the plans. Most project managers would recommend gutting and replacing the entire section. "That's because they see the house as a problem to solve," James replied, surprising himself with his conviction. "But it's more like a patient that needs healing. You have to work with its strengths, not just fix its weaknesses." He caught Catherine watching him with an expression that made him momentarily forget about support beams and budget concerns. Then David cleared his throat from nearby, and James returned his attention to the crisis at hand. "I've already contacted our suppliers about materials," he continued. "If we redirect some resources from the non-essential exterior work, we can absorb about 40% of the cost overrun. I've also identified several areas where we can compress the timeline once the structural work is complete." Catherine held up her hand, stopping his careful justification. "James, you don't need to convince me. This is exactly why you're in charge of this project. The Foundation's board chartered us to do this right, not just quickly or cheaply." The tension in the room visibly eased. Teams broke into focused groups, each tackling their assigned portions of the solution. James found himself moving between them, answering questions and coordinating efforts with an authority that felt increasingly natural. Later that afternoon, as the emergency activity settled into organized purpose, he overheard two of the engineers and talking during their coffee break. "Morgan really knows his stuff," one said admiringly. "Did you see how he anticipated the load distribution issues before the computer models even finished running? That's what you get with real-world experience." The other replied, "Can't learn that kind of instinct from books." James smiled to himself, remembering all the times he'd had to solve similar problems with nothing but determination and whatever materials he could afford. Now, with proper resources and a team that respected his knowledge, those years of making do had become something valuable. Through the window, he could see Emma getting off her school bus. She waved their special signal, 3 fingers, peace sign, thumbs up, then pointed excitedly at the construction progress. James waved back, thinking how every challenge solved was another step toward the future they were building, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. The garden journal lay open on the temporary apartment's coffee table, Sarah's careful handwriting illuminated by the evening lamp. James sat on the couch, turning his wedding ring absently while Catherine studied the detailed flower sketches. They planned to bring to life. She had quite an eye for design, Catherine observed softly, her finger tracing a diagram for a butterfly garden. The way she planned for continuous blooming throughout the seasons. "Sarah believed in thinking ahead," James replied, his voice warm with memories rather than heavy with grief. "She used to say gardens were hope made visible. You plant today for tomorrow's flowers." Emma had gone to bed an hour ago, after an evening spent helping them match Sarah's sketches to modern gardening catalogues. Her enthusiasm for the project had been infectious, though James noticed how carefully she watched him whenever Sarah's name came up. "You know," Catherine said, closing the journal gently, "I've never told anyone this, but I lost my father just before my first major restoration project." She smiled at James's surprised look. "He was like you in many ways, practical, hard-working, determined to give his child every opportunity he never had." James felt something shift in the quiet room, as if a window had opened to let in fresh air. "How did you handle it? Moving forward, I mean." Catherine considered the question, her silver hair catching the lamplight. "Gradually I learned that moving forward didn't mean leaving him behind. Every skill he taught me, every lesson about integrity and hard work, they became part of my foundation." She met James's eyes. "Just like Sarah's love for beauty and planning lives on in that garden journal." The understanding in her voice touched something deep in James's heart. Without thinking, he reached up and removed his wedding ring, looking at it properly for the first time in years. The simple gold band caught the light, holding memories of a love that had shaped him into the father and man he was today. Emma. "Asked me last week if I ever get lonely," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "I didn't know how to tell her that missing Sarah and being ready to feel again aren't mutually exclusive." "Aren't they?" Catherine's question was gentle, inviting rather than pressing. James turned to face her fully. "I'm beginning to understand that love isn't a limited resource, like money or time. It's more like," he gestured to the garden journal, "like Sarah's garden plans. Each season brings its own kind of beauty, without diminishing what came before." Catherine's eyes softened with emotion. "James," she began, but was interrupted by a small sound from the hallway. Emma stood there, in her pajamas, trying to look as if she hadn't been eavesdropping. "I had a dream about Mom," she said quickly, before either adult could speak. "She was planting flowers and laughing. It was a good dream." James opened his arms and Emma came to him, curling into his side like she used to when she was smaller. He felt her fingers brush the ring he still held. "Dad," she whispered, "I think Mom would want us to be happy. All of us." Her eyes moved meaningfully to Catherine, who looked touched by the child's implicit inclusion. "I think so too, Sunshine," James replied, his voice rough with emotion. He slipped the ring into his pocket, not discarding it, but transitioning it from a barrier to a treasured memory. Catherine rose gracefully, gathering her coat. "I should go. It's getting late and we have that meeting with the landscape architect tomorrow." At the door, she paused. "James, Emma's right. Sarah's garden plans. They're not just about flowers, are they? They're about nurturing growth, about believing in future beauty." She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you for sharing them with me." After she left, James sat with Emma until she fell asleep again, his daughter's head heavy against his shoulder. On the coffee table, Sarah's garden journal lay beside Catherine's preliminary landscaping proposals, past and future in perfect harmony. James touched his empty ring finger, feeling not the absence of what had been, but the possibility of what might be. Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, nourishing soil that would soon burst with new life, planted by hands that understood both remembrance and renewal. The change began quietly, like the first shoots of spring pushing through winter soil. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed it first, how people started lingering on their porches in the evening, watching the transformation of the Victorian and the Morgan house with growing interest. Soon, neighbors who had barely exchanged more than quick waves for years found themselves gathering to discuss the progress, sharing coffee and speculation about what might come next. James discovered this ripple effect. One Saturday morning, when Mr. Peterson appeared at the Victorian's front gate, clutching a yellowed photograph. "Found this in my attic," the elderly man announced. "Thought you might want to see the house as it looked in 1952, when my parents first moved to the street." The photo revealed details that even the architectural plans hadn't captured. Intricate woodwork that had long since been painted over, original landscaping patterns that could guide their restoration efforts. More importantly, it sparked a flood of community memories. "My grandmother used to work as a housekeeper here," Mrs. Rodriguez shared, studying the image. "She always said the morning light through those east windows could lift anyone's spirits." Catherine, overhearing, immediately invited them both to join the weekend's planning session. Soon, the Victorian's main room became an unofficial community center, with long-time residents sharing stories and insights that enriched the restoration work in ways no architectural survey could match. "It's not just about preserving buildings," Catherine explained to the Foundation's board during their site visit. "It's about weaving the community's memories into its future." She gestured to where Emma was giving a group of neighbors a tour of the progress, her voice carrying clearly through the spring air. "This archway," Emma was saying, pointing to a newly restored feature. "Dad says it's like the backbone of the house," helping it stand tall for another 100 years, just like how everyone in the neighborhood helps each other stand tall. The board members exchanged impressed glances, but James felt his chest tighten with pride for reasons that had nothing to do with professional approval. His daughter had captured perfectly what this project had become, not just a renovation, but a revival of community spirit. That spirit proved contagious. The owner of the local hardware store began offering discounts to residents inspired to tackle their own home improvements. A retired carpenter volunteered to teach basic woodworking classes in his garage. Even the city council took notice, fast-tracking approval for additional street lighting and sidewalk repairs. "You've started something remarkable here," Catherine told James one evening as they watched a group of neighbors planting flowers along the Victorians' restored walkway. The garden design incorporated elements from Sarah's journal, adapted by the community into a collaborative effort that honored her vision while creating something new. "We all needed this," James replied, understanding now what Catherine had seen when she first chose their neighborhood. Not just the physical improvements, but the reminder that we're all connected to this place and each other. The project's influence reached even further when Emma's teacher asked her to present about the restoration work at the school's career day. James sat in the back of the classroom, Catherine beside him, as their daughter stood confidently before her peers. "Some people think old houses are just buildings," Emma began, displaying before and after photos on the classroom screen. "But my dad taught me they're really stories waiting to be remembered. And when we restore them, we're not just fixing walls and windows, we're helping those stories continue." She went on to explain the technical aspects of restoration work with surprising accuracy, but it was her description of the community's involvement that captured her audience's attention. Stories of neighbors sharing skills and memories, of children helping plant gardens, of families rediscovering their connection to the neighborhood's history. After the presentation, Emma's teacher pulled James aside. "Several parents have asked if we could organize a field trip to see the restoration work," she said. "They think it could inspire the children to take more interest in local history and community service." That evening, as James reviewed the day's progress reports in his office, he found himself repeatedly drawn to the window. Outside, the street had come alive with activity. Mrs. Rodriguez was teaching younger neighbors her secret recipe for empanadas on her porch. Mr. Peterson and the retired carpenter were examining a neighbor's wobbly fence, discussing repair strategies. Children played while parents chatted, the atmosphere reminiscent of stories he'd heard about how the neighborhood used to be. Catherine appeared in his doorway, a fresh stack of community improvement proposals in her hands. "Ready to dream bigger?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with possibility. James looked at the papers, then back at the scene outside his window. "I think," he said slowly, "we're all ready to believe in restoration, of buildings, of community, of hope itself." Through the gentle spring evening, the sound of laughter and conversation rose like music, a symphony of renewal that had started with a single act of neighborly kindness on a cold winter night. The storm hit without warning on a quiet Sunday afternoon in late April. What started as spring rain quickly evolved into something more menacing, with wind-driven sheets of water that seemed to find every vulnerable point in the Victorians' partially restored exterior. James was at his own house, reviewing final paint samples with Emma, when David Chen's urgent call came through. "The tarps didn't hold," David reported, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Water's coming in through the exposed section of roof, and the temporary supports in the east wing are showing signs of stress." James was already pulling on his work boots. "Call in everyone who can safely make it. I'm on my way." He turned to Emma, who was watching him with worried eyes. "Sunshine, I need you to—" "Stay with me," Catherine interrupted, appearing in the doorway, rain dripping from her coat. "I'll keep Emma company while you handle this." The gratitude James felt was complicated by a flash of something else, the growing awareness of how naturally Catherine had become part of their crisis management system. But there wasn't time to examine that feeling. Outside, thunder cracked ominously. At the Victorian, the situation was worse than he'd feared. Water cascaded down the grand staircase like a malicious waterfall, pooling in the newly restored foyer. The architectural plans they'd carefully preserved were threatening to float off their storage tables, and somewhere above, wood groaned in protest against the storm's fury. "Save what documentation you can," James directed the team members who'd managed to arrive. "Then focus on reinforcing the temporary supports. Water damage we can fix, structural failure we can't risk." For hours, they battled against nature's determination to undo months of careful restoration. James moved between crisis points, his experience with emergency repairs proving invaluable. But this was different from patching a leaky roof or fixing a broken window. This was watching a dream threaten to dissolve in the rain. The first hint of real trouble came with a sound James had learned to dread in his years of construction work, the distinct crack of wooden beams under too much stress. It came from the East Wing, where they'd been gradually reinforcing the historical support structure. "Everyone out!" he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned about danger the hard way. "Clear the East Wing now!" They barely made it. With a groan that seemed to rise from the house's very foundation, a section of the temporarily supported ceiling gave way, bringing down with it chunks of historical plaster and weeks of restoration work. In the rain-drummed silence that followed, James stood in the doorway of the ruined room, mentally calculating the damage. The specialized materials they'd carefully sourced, the intricate plasterwork they'd painstakingly restored, the antique fixtures they'd finally located, all would need to be replaced. Worse, the structural damage would force them to essentially start over on this entire section. His phone buzzed with a message from the Foundation's board chairman. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Full damage assessment required." James felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just about the Victorian anymore. The Foundation's investment, the community's hopes, his own family's future, all had become intertwined with this project's success. The rain finally began to ease around midnight. In the beam of emergency work lights, James surveyed the damage. With David and the structural engineer who'd braved the storm to assist them, the numbers they calculated were staggering. Hundreds of thousands in additional costs, months of delayed completion, specialized materials that would need to be reordered from craftsmen who already had long waiting lists. "We can salvage some of it," David offered, his usual optimism strained but present. "The techniques you developed for the beam replacement, we could adapt those." James nodded absently, but his mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's board meeting. He'd have to explain how they'd failed to adequately protect against this possibility, how they'd need to essentially rebuild their budget from scratch, how all their careful plans had been undone in a single stormy afternoon. When he finally made it back to his house, he found Emma asleep on the couch, clutching Sarah's garden journal. Catherine sat nearby, working on her laptop despite the late hour. "I've already drafted preliminary revision proposals for the board," she said quietly, not looking up. "We can redirect funds from the non-essential exterior work, apply for emergency historical preservation grants, maybe accelerate the community involvement program." "Catherine," James interrupted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "This isn't your responsibility to fix. I was the one in charge. I should have..." "Should have what?" she challenged, finally meeting his eyes. "Controlled the weather? The Foundation chose this project, chose you, because we believed in the possibility of restoration against the odds. One storm doesn't change that. The board will listen to our revised plan," she stated firmly, "because we're going to show them exactly what you showed me that first night with the broken window. That sometimes the biggest challenges lead to the most innovative solutions. Emma stirred on the couch, blinking awake. Dad, is the Victorian okay? James looked at his daughter, then at Catherine, seeing in both their faces a reflection of his own determination not to let this setback defeat them. The Victorian, he said carefully, is teaching us something your mom always believed, that anything worth building is worth rebuilding as many times as it takes. Outside, the storm clouds were finally breaking, revealing a sky where stars struggled to shine through the clearing darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this room with these people, James felt the first stirrings of what might have been hope. The Foundation's boardroom felt impossibly quiet after the chaos of the previous night. James stood before the gathered members, his presentation materials organized with the same precision he'd once applied to organizing his tool belt. But instead of hiding his background as a handyman, he now drew upon it with confidence. The storm damage revealed something we might have missed otherwise, he began, spreading out the revised plans. The Victorians' original architect included a series of copper drainage channels within the walls, an innovative system for its time, but one that had been covered up by later renovations. By restoring and modernizing this system, we can actually improve the building's resilience against future weather events. Catherine, sitting among the board members, gave him an encouraging nod. The night before, they'd worked until dawn, transforming disaster into opportunity. Emma had stayed up too, making them coffee and offering surprisingly insightful suggestions about how to present their findings. The additional costs, James continued, can be partially offset by implementing a community apprenticeship program. We have skilled craftsmen in the neighborhood willing to train local youth in traditional restoration techniques. This reduces our labor costs while creating sustainable job opportunities. Mr. Peterson had been the first to volunteer, offering decades of carpentry experience. Mrs. Rodriguez's son, who ran a successful contracting business in the next town, had already pledged to provide professional certifications for program graduates. Most importantly, James concluded, this setback has shown us the true strength of our project, not just in the buildings we're restoring, but in the community that's come together to support them. Last night, while we were fighting to save the Victorian, neighbors were organizing shelter for our displaced work crews, sharing meals and planning fundraising efforts. He gestured to the window, where they could see people already gathering at the work site, armed with tools and determination. These aren't just houses we're restoring. They're homes, in the deepest sense of the word. And home is something worth fighting for. The board's deliberation was shorter than anyone expected. The chairman, a distinguished woman who reminded James of a more formal version of Mrs. Rodriguez, spoke for them all. Mr. Morgan, she said, when Ms. Wells first proposed this project, she spoke about finding someone who understood both the technical and human elements of restoration. I believe we're seeing exactly what she meant. She smiled, warming her official tone. The additional funding is approved, along with your proposed community integration programs. The relief in the room was palpable, but it was Catherine's quiet pride that affected James the most. As they gathered their materials, she touched his arm lightly. You know what impressed them most, she asked. Not the technical solutions, though those were brilliant. It was seeing how you've helped this project become something bigger than just renovation work. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the storm's remnants, revealing a sky as full of promise as their newly approved plans. They arrived at the Victorian to find the cleanup already underway, organized by David Chen with clipboard efficiency. Emma was there too, wearing the junior project manager badge Catherine had given her, directing a group of neighborhood kids in sorting salvageable materials. When she saw James, her face lit up with a question she didn't need to voice. We're back on track, sunshine, he confirmed. Better than before, actually. The news spread quickly through the work site, lifting spirits and redoubling efforts. James moved among the volunteers. no longer just a supervisor, but a leader who had earned his authority through more than technical expertise. By afternoon, the damaged section was fully cleared, revealing the hidden drainage system James had discovered. He stood with Catherine in the exposed room, where sunlight now streamed through temporary tarps, creating patterns that reminded him of the way light had played through Sarah's favorite stained glass window. "You know," Catherine said thoughtfully, "most people would have seen only destruction in that storm. You saw possibility." "I had good teachers," James replied, thinking of Sarah's persistence, of Emma's optimism, of Catherine's faith in his abilities. "And somewhere along the way I learned that sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt stronger." A call from outside drew their attention. Emma stood in the garden, waving excitedly. Around her, neighbors had begun planting the first flowers from Sarah's journal, not waiting for the building work to be completed, but creating beauty amid the restoration process itself. "Dad! Mrs. Rodriguez says these roses are just like the ones that used to grow here 50 years ago." James watched as Catherine moved to join his daughter, the two of them bending over the garden plans with shared enthusiasm. The sight stirred something in his heart, not the sharp pain of loss he'd grown used to, but the warm recognition of growth, of life continuing to bloom in unexpected places. In that moment, standing in a room that had been broken and would soon be renewed, James understood that restoration wasn't just about returning things to their former state. It was about finding the courage to build something new while honoring what came before, in buildings, in communities, and in love itself. The key ceremony was Catherine's idea, a way to mark not just the completion of the renovations, but the beginning of something new. Standing on the Victorians' restored front porch, James held the antique brass key she'd had specially made, its weight in his palm, representing far more than just access to a building. "The Foundation is pleased to officially appoint James Morgan as the permanent director of our Milton Street Historical District," Catherine announced to the gathered crowd. "This house will serve as both his office and the community's restoration center, where the next generation of craftsmen will learn to preserve our architectural heritage." The applause that followed felt different from any recognition James had received before. It wasn't just approval, it was acceptance, appreciation, and something deeper that spoke of roots taking hold in fertile soil. Emma stood beside him, practically vibrating with excitement. Today wasn't just about the Victorians' completion. They would also be moving back into their own restored home. But first, there was the matter of the scholarship announcement. "Additionally," Catherine continued, her eyes sparkling with barely contained joy, "the Foundation's educational initiative will begin with its first recipient." She paused, building anticipation, though everyone already knew who it would be. Emma Morgan will receive a full scholarship to pursue her architectural studies, starting with the city's premier STEM academy this fall. This time, the applause was led by Emma's friends from the Youth Apprenticeship Program, teenagers who had discovered their own passion for restoration work over the past months. James watched his daughter accept the scholarship certificate, seeing in her confident stance echoes of both Sarah's grace and Catherine's poise. The celebration moved through both houses, the Victorian and the Morgan home, with people flowing between them as naturally as if they were one continuous space. In a way, they were. The gardens Sarah had planned now connected the properties, blooming with early summer flowers that seemed to celebrate along with everyone else. "Your mother would have loved this," Mrs. Rodriguez told Emma, gesturing to the garden where children played between beds of blooming roses. "She always said this neighborhood just needed someone to believe in it." James found himself in his newly restored kitchen, running his hand along countertops that managed to look both modern and timeless. The space had been redesigned to retain its original character while incorporating subtle updates that made it more functional. Like everything else about the renovation, it represented a perfect balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. "We kept her message," Catherine said softly, joining him. She pointed to the wall where Sarah's handwritten note, Morgan Family Kitchen, Estin 2010, had been carefully preserved and framed, and added something new beside it. The new addition was a simple ceramic tile, hand-painted by Emma, restored with love 2025. It's perfect, James said, his voice rough with emotion. He turned to Catherine, seeing in her eyes the same mix of feelings that filled his heart. All of it, the house, the Victorian, the community program. You gave us back our future. No, Catherine corrected gently. You did that yourself. I just opened a window of opportunity. You're the one who was brave enough to climb through it. Their moment was interrupted by Emma bursting in, followed by David Chen and several board members. Dad, they want to know if we can expand the apprenticeship program to other neighborhoods. And Mrs. Rodriguez's son says he can offer summer internships at his company. The afternoon flowed into evening, and slowly the crowd thinned, leaving behind the warmth of celebration and the promise of more good days to come. Emma had gone up to arrange her room exactly as she wanted it, a privilege they'd promised her. Once the renovation was complete, James and Catherine stood in the garden between the two houses, watching the sunset paint the restored buildings in shades of gold. The Victorian stood proud and elegant, ready for its new role as a centre of community learning and growth. The Morgan home glowed with welcoming warmth, its lights promising comfort and belonging. You know, Catherine said thoughtfully, when I first came to this neighborhood, I thought I was looking for a restoration project. She turned to face James, her silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight. I never expected to find a home. James took her hand, a gesture that felt as natural as using his favorite tools. Sometimes the best renovations are the ones we don't plan for. From upstairs, they could hear Emma singing, Sarah's old lullaby mixed with something new of her own creation. The garden around them bloomed with flowers that Sarah had dreamed of but never seen, tended by hands that were carrying her love forward into a future she would have cherished. The brass key to the Victorian still sat in James's pocket, but he realized he didn't need it to know he was exactly where he belonged. Home, after all, wasn't just about buildings. It was about the hearts that filled them, the dreams they sheltered, and the love that, like Sarah's carefully planned gardens, could bloom season after season in ever-new ways. The first snow of December transformed Milton Street into a scene worthy of a holiday card. Christmas lights twinkled from restored porches, their warm glow reflecting off fresh snow that blanketed Sarah's winter gardens. Inside the Morgan home, the scent of pine mingled with sugar cookies, Emma's first solo baking attempt, supervised by Catherine with the same careful attention she gave to historical restoration projects. Mom's recipe said 2 cups of flour, Emma announced, frowning at the well-worn index card. But I think we added too much. They're not spreading like they should. James paused in hanging the family stockings. 3 now. The newest one hand-knitted by Mrs. Rodriguez to match the others. Your mother always said baking was more art than science. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts. Like restoration work? Emma asked, carefully transferring cookies to a cooling rack. The parallel made Catherine smile as she wiped flour from her hands. Exactly like that, she agreed. Speaking of which, how's your final project for the STEM Academy coming along? Emma's eyes lit up. I'm designing a community center based on Victorian architectural principles, but with modern sustainability features. Dad's been helping me understand load-bearing calculations, and I used some of Mum's garden designs for the landscaping plan. The easy way she wove together these different parts of their lives, past and present, practical and aspirational, caught James in the heart. Here was his daughter, no longer trying to hide her dreams, but confidently building them into reality, just as they'd rebuilt their home. The doorbell chimed and Emma rushed to answer it, knowing it would be David Chen and his family arriving for their weekly dinner tradition. These Sunday gatherings had started spontaneously during the renovation and somehow became an essential part of their new life, with different neighbors joining each week. I brought my grandmother's almond cookies, David called out, stomping. Snow from his boots. And Mom sent her famous dumplings. His mother, it turned out, was the very same Mrs. Chen who had taught Catherine to cook all those years ago, a connection that seemed too perfect to be coincidence. As their guests settled, James found himself watching Catherine arrange plates with the same precise care she used in restoration planning. She'd become such a natural part of their home that sometimes he forgot there had ever been a time without her there, helping Emma with homework at the kitchen island or discussing project plans over morning coffee. "Penny for your thoughts," she said softly, catching his contemplative look. "Just thinking about restoration," he replied. "Not of buildings this time." She understood, as she always did. Coming to stand beside him, she touched the Christmas stockings gently. "Emma asked me yesterday if it was okay to hang a picture of Sarah next to our family photos from the Foundation's holiday party. She wanted to make sure I wouldn't mind." James held his breath, though he already knew Catherine's answer. She'd shown such grace in understanding that Sarah would always be part of their family story. "I told her," Catherine continued, "that love isn't like a house with limited room. It's more like her mother's garden, always ready to grow something new, alongside what's already blooming." From the kitchen came the sound of Emma laughing with David's children, teaching them the proper way to decorate sugar cookies, using techniques that blended Sarah's artistic flair with Catherine's attention to detail. The result would probably be wonderfully imperfect, like all the best collaborations. Later, after their guests had gone, and Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, surrounded by cookie crumbs and architectural drawings, James and Catherine stood at the window watching snow continue to fall. The Victorian next door glowed warmly, its windows reflecting light like a beacon for the community it had become. "I got the final approval for the expansion project today," Catherine said quietly. 3 more neighborhoods will be starting their own restoration programs in the spring. They want you to oversee the training of the new project managers." James nodded, unsurprised. Their success had drawn attention from other communities eager to replicate what they'd achieved, but that wasn't what made his heart full on this winter evening. What mattered was the way Emma had carefully hung Catherine's ornament on the tree right next to the angel Sarah had loved. The way their restored home held space for both memory and possibility. The way love, like their neighborhood, could be renewed without losing its foundation. "You know what Sarah used to say about winter gardens?" he asked, wrapping an arm around Catherine's waist, "that they remind us how beauty rests but never truly disappears. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again." Catherine leaned into him, understanding all that he wasn't saying. Outside, snow continued to fall on Sarah's sleeping garden, on the Victorians' restored grandeur, on the community they'd built together. Inside, the warmth of their blended family filled every restored room with the kind of love that, like the best architecture, only grew stronger with time. 1 year after the Victorians' restoration, James stood in his office, once the grand parlour, surrounded by photographs documenting the transformation of not just buildings but lives. The latest addition to the wall showed Emma accepting a National Youth Achievement Award for her community architecture program, which paired experienced craftsmen with local students interested in historical preservation. "Your daughter's program has become a model for other communities," Catherine remarked, entering with 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual that had become as natural as breathing. "The Foundation's board is talking about implementing it nationwide." James accepted the coffee, still amazed sometimes at how far they'd come. Through the window, he could see Mr. Peterson teaching a group of teenagers the art of wood restoration, his expertise now formally recognized with a Master Craftsman certification. Mrs. Rodriguez's cooking classes in the Victorians' restored kitchen had evolved into a successful catering business, specializing in historical recipes, employing several neighborhood residents. "Did you see Emma's college application essays?" he asked, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "She's writing about how restoration work taught her that progress doesn't mean erasing history. It means building on its foundation." Catherine smiled, settling into what had become her usual spot on the window seat. She's not the only one learning that lesson. The Milton Street model has inspired similar projects in 12 other neighborhoods now. Communities are realizing that preservation can be about growth, not just maintenance. The evidence of that growth surrounded them. The Victorian had become more than just a restoration center. It was a community hub where classes in everything, from historical crafts to modern sustainability practices, were taught daily. The gardens, planned from Sarah's journal and expanded through community input, had won Urban Beautification Awards and inspired a neighborhood-wide gardening program. "Remember that first night?" James mused, joining Catherine by the window. "When you stood out there with a broken window and I had no idea my life was about to change. I knew the moment you started explaining about old windows having character," Catherine admitted. "The foundation had interviewed dozens of qualified contractors, but you were the first one who understood that buildings are really about the people who give them life." Their conversation was interrupted by David Chen arriving with the latest progress reports from their expansion projects. The restored Victorian had become headquarters for a growing network of community renewal initiatives, each adapted to preserve the unique character of its neighborhood while fostering economic opportunity. "The apprenticeship program has a 90% job placement rate," David reported proudly, "and 3 of our original students are now leading their own restoration teams in other communities." James reviewed the reports, noting how many of their innovations had become standard practices. The historical preservation grants they'd pioneered now included funding for community education. Their sustainable restoration techniques had been featured in national trade publications. Even their crisis management strategies from the storm damage had become a case study in resilient renovation, but it was the smaller successes that meant the most. The elderly resident who could finally afford to repair her ancestral home, the young couple starting a family in a beautifully restored apartment, the teenager discovering a passion for traditional craftsmanship. Emma burst in, her school uniform slightly rumpled from what was clearly an excited rush. "Dad! Catherine! Guess what? The Historical Society wants our restoration team to consult on the old library project downtown, and they specifically requested my garden integration plans." James watched his daughter spread her drawings across his desk, her confidence a beautiful blend of Sarah's creativity and Catherine's precision. At 13, Emma had already found her calling, her talent for blending historical preservation with modern needs, earning recognition far beyond their community. "They love how we used Mom's seasonal planning approach," Emma explained, pointing to her carefully drafted landscapes. "And they want to implement our community involvement model too." Catherine moved to study the plans, her hand naturally finding James's as they listened to Emma's enthusiastic presentation. These moments still caught him sometimes, the perfect rightness of their blended family, built like their restored homes on the sturdy foundation of what came before, while embracing all the promise of what lay ahead. Later that evening, as sunset painted the Victorian's restored facade in shades of amber, the 3 of them walked through Sarah's garden. Spring flowers were just beginning to bloom, their emergence a testament to the careful planning in her journal and the loving maintenance of many hands since. "You know what makes our restoration work different?" Emma asked thoughtfully. "Touching." A rose that had grown from one of her mother's carefully preserved cuttings. "We don't just fix things, we help them grow into something new while keeping what made them special in the first place." James exchanged a glance with Catherine, seeing in her eyes the same recognition of how perfectly their daughter had captured the heart of not just their work, but their journey together. Like the buildings they restored, like the gardens they tended, like love itself, growth wasn't about replacement, but about careful nurturing of old and new together. On a crisp autumn evening, Much like the one that had started everything 2 years ago, James stood before a different broken window. This time, he wasn't alone. Catherine held the flashlight, while Emma carefully measured the vintage glass they'd sourced for the repair. Around them, the next generation of restoration apprentices watched intently. "Remember," James explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience and the lightness of joy, "old windows aren't just about glass and wood. They're the eyes of a house, the way it watches over its family through the years. When we restore them, we're not just fixing something broken, we're preserving a piece of that watchful care." The window belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez's house, the last on their street to receive a full restoration. Its repair marked the completion of their original neighborhood project, though their work had long since expanded beyond Milton Street's boundaries. "Dad used to say that about our first window," Emma told the apprentices, carefully holding a piece of glass in place. "Back when Catherine found us, though she says it was really the other way around." Catherine smiled, adjusting the light. "Sometimes the best finds are the ones you weren't looking for," she said, her free hand finding James's with the ease of long familiarity. The golden band on her finger caught the light, matching the one James now wore, different from his first wedding ring, but no less meaningful. Their wedding last month had been a community celebration, held in Sarah's fully matured garden between the Victorian and their home. Emma had walked Catherine down the aisle, both of them carrying bouquets grown from Sarah's carefully preserved seeds. The entire neighborhood had contributed to the restoration-themed ceremony, from Mrs. Rodriguez's historical recipe feast to Mr. Peterson's hand-carved arch, decorated with architectural salvage from their various projects. The window repair proceeded smoothly, each step a demonstration of both technical skill and deeper understanding. When they finished, the setting sun streamed through the restored glass, casting familiar patterns on the floor, the same kind of light that had first shown James the possibility of change 2 years ago. "Beautiful work," Mrs. Rodriguez declared, bringing out her signature lemonade for everyone. "Though I think you're fixing more than just windows these days." She was right. Their restoration work had become a model for community renewal across the country. But more than that, it had shown how broken things, be they buildings, neighborhoods, or hearts, could be made whole again, often stronger than before. Emma, now 14 and already taking advanced architecture classes, stood back to admire their work. "It's like you always say, Dad. The best restoration doesn't erase the past, it builds a bridge to the future." James wrapped an arm around his daughter, marveling at how she'd grown into a young woman who understood so deeply what they were really doing here. Catherine joined them, completing their family circle as naturally as if she'd always been part of it. Through the newly restored window, they could see the Victorian standing proud next door, its lights warming the gathering. Dusk. The building that had once been a symbol of neighborhood decline now served as a beacon of hope. Its doors opened daily to those seeking to learn, grow, and rebuild. Sarah's gardens bloomed in every season now, tended by many hands, her careful. Plans expanded, but never forgotten. Like the neighborhood itself, they had grown into something she might not have envisioned, but would surely have loved. A place where past and present flowered together, where broken things were made beautiful. Again, where love itself could be restored without diminishing what came before. "Ready to head home?" Catherine asked as the apprentices gathered their tools, the day's lesson complete. James looked at his family, the daughter who carried Sarah's creativity forward in her own unique way, the woman who had helped him build a new life without losing the beauty of the old one, the community that had become an extended family to them all. Through the newly restored window, the last light of day transformed ordinary glass into something magical, reminding him that sometimes the most profound changes came from simple acts of care. "I am home," he said softly. "We all are."